Today, I will explain how Columbus founded America. Let me know when and where are you watching this video from. Now, let's begin. Before the ships ever touched the unknown shore, before the name Christopher Columbus echoed through courts and chronicles, Europe itself was restless. The 15th century was an age of hunger. Hunger for gold, for spices, for power, for salvation, for glory. The old routes to the east, once alive with caravans and merchant ships, were slowly closing. The Ottoman Empire now controlled much of the land trade, and every sack of pepper or clove passed through many hands, growing more expensive with each mile. Kings and queens felt trapped on the edge of a continent, staring westward at an endless ocean they barely understood. Maps of the time were strange and incomplete. They showed Europe, parts of Africa, and a vague idea of Asia stretching far to the east. Beyond that was mostly emptiness, sometimes filled with sea monsters, boiling waters, or dark warnings written by cautious mapmakers. Yet some scholars believed the world was round, not flat, and that Asia could be reached by sailing west. Among those who believed this idea most strongly was a man born far from royal palaces in the busy port city of Genoa. Christopher Columbus grew up surrounded by ships. As a boy, he watched sails rise and fall in the harbor like white birds. He listened to sailors talk about storms, distant islands, and fortunes made and lost. The sea shaped him early. He learned to read winds and waves, to calculate distance by the stars, to trust his instincts, even when the horizon offered no answers. By the time he was a grown man, the ocean no longer frightened him. It called to him. Columbus was not a king, not a noble, not even especially wealthy. But he had something powerful, belief. He believed that the world was smaller than most people thought. He believed Asia lay, not impossibly, far to the west, but just beyond the horizon, waiting to be reached. And more than that, he believed it was his destiny to be the one who would reach it. For years, Columbus carried his idea from court to court. He presented his calculations, his maps, his confidence. Again and again, he was rejected. Portugal, a nation already skilled in sea travel, said no. Experts argued his numbers were wrong, that the ocean was far wider than he claimed. They warned that any ship sailing west would run out of food and water long before reaching land. Columbus listened, but he did not change his mind. He simply moved on. Eventually, he arrived in Spain, a kingdom freshly united under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. The country was tired from war, but filled with ambition. Spain wanted wealth, influence, and a place among the great powers of Europe. Columbus waited patiently, sometimes desperately, as his proposal was debated. Years passed. He lived on promises and hope, often close to poverty. Still, he refused to give up. Then, at last, in 1492, the answer changed. Spain agreed to support the voyage. Columbus was granted ships, a crew, and titles he had only dreamed of. If he succeeded, he would become admiral of the ocean sea and governor of any lands he discovered. For Columbus, this was not just opportunity. It felt like confirmation that fate itself had chosen him. On a warm August morning, 3 ships waited in the harbor of Palos. They were not large or impressive. The Santa Maria was the biggest, a sturdy but slow vessel. The Nina and the Pinta were smaller, faster caravels, built for exploration. Together, they carried about 90 men. Most were ordinary sailors, not heroes. Some were criminals offered freedom in exchange for service. Many were afraid, though they hid it behind jokes and bravado. As the ships pulled away from the shore, bells rang and prayers were whispered. Families watched from the docks, knowing there was a real chance they would never see their sons or husbands again. The sails filled with wind, and Spain slowly faded into the distance. At first, the journey was calm. The ships followed familiar routes along the coast of Africa and then to the Canary Islands. Repairs were made. Supplies were checked. Spirits were still high. But once the fleet turned west, everything changed. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of them, day after day, with no land in sight. The compass behaved strangely. Winds pushed them forward into waters no European ship had ever crossed before. Weeks passed. Food began to spoil. Water grew stale. The men grew restless. Whispers spread at night. Some sailors believed they were sailing into a trap, a place from which no one returned. They feared monsters, endless seas, or falling off the edge of the world. Columbus tried to calm them, sometimes lying about distances traveled to make the journey seem shorter than it was. He kept 2 logs, one for himself and one for the crew. Each sunrise brought hope. Each sunset brought disappointment. Still, Columbus stood firm on the deck, staring westward. He believed land was close. He had to, because if he was wrong, the ocean would soon make that truth painfully clear. And as the ships continued deeper into the unknown, with tension growing and patience thinning, the fate of everyone on board began to hang on a single question. How much longer could belief hold when the sea offered no answers at all? The ocean no longer felt like a road. It felt like a prison without walls. By the 3rd week of sailing west, the men aboard the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta had begun to change. Faces once filled with excitement grew tight and hollow. Hands that once worked ropes with confidence now hesitated, as if the sea itself might strike back. Every creak of wood sounded louder at night. Every wave seemed suspicious. The wind pushed them forward steadily, almost too steadily. It came from behind, day after day, filling the sails and carrying the ships farther west. At first, this was a blessing. Later, it became a curse. The sailors began to wonder if the wind would ever allow them to return east. If the ocean could push them forward so easily, what would stop it from trapping them forever? Strange signs appeared. Clumps of green seaweed floated past the ships, thick enough to slow their movement. Some men whispered that they had entered waters where ships became stuck, swallowed by the sea. Birds appeared, then vanished again, teasing them with the promise of land. Columbus noticed everything. He watched the color of the water change. He studied the flight of birds. He measured the wind with the patience of a man balancing hope against fear. At night, the sailors talked quietly. They spoke of home, of wives and children, of warm bread and solid ground. Some cursed Columbus under their breath. Others blamed themselves for agreeing to come. A few openly questioned the voyage, their voices growing sharper with each passing day. Columbus heard the murmurs. He saw the looks. He understood the danger was no longer just the ocean, it was his own crew. To keep control, Columbus became both leader and actor. He showed confidence, even when doubt pressed heavily on his chest. He spoke of signs from God. He reminded the men of the riches waiting ahead: gold, spices, silk, fame. When fear rose too high, he promised they would turn back if land did not appear soon. He chose his words carefully, knowing that one mistake could spark rebellion. But inside, Columbus was counting days. By early October, the tension reached a breaking point. The men were exhausted. Food supplies were shrinking. Fresh water was carefully rationed. The ocean seemed endless, mocking them with its calm surface. Some sailors openly demanded that Columbus turn back. They argued that they had gone too far, that no land existed in this direction. The threat of mutiny hung in the air like a storm cloud. Columbus gathered the crew and spoke to them. He did not beg. He did not shout. He promised that if land was not sighted within a few days, they would return to Spain. It was a gamble, one that rested entirely on his belief that land was close. If he was wrong, his authority would vanish. His dream would die in the middle of the Atlantic. That same night, Columbus claimed to see a distant light flickering on the horizon. It rose and fell like a candle carried by an unseen hand. He pointed it out, though others could not clearly see it. Was it real, or was his mind creating hope where none existed? No one could be sure. But the idea of land took hold again, fragile but powerful. On October 11, the ships moved slowly through the darkness. The crew stood alert, eyes straining forward. Then, just after midnight, a cry shattered the silence. Land. The shout came from the Pinta. A sailor named Rodrigo de Triana had spotted it first, a dark shape rising against the stars. The news spread instantly. Men laughed, cried, dropped to their knees. Some embraced each other. Others stared ahead in disbelief, afraid the vision would disappear if they blinked. As dawn broke, the shape became clearer. A low, green island sat on the horizon, quiet and real. After more than a month at sea, solid ground had finally answered their prayers. Columbus dressed carefully that morning. He put on fine clothes, not the worn garments of a sailor, but the attire of a man ready to claim history. The ships anchored near the shore. The water was clear and shallow. The sand was pale. Palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Birds filled the air with unfamiliar calls. The land did not look like Asia, but Columbus pushed the thought aside. He believed he had reached islands near the coast of Asia. He believed this with his whole heart. When Columbus stepped onto the shore, he carried a royal banner. He knelt, kissed the ground, and gave thanks to God. He named the island San Salvador. In the name of Spain, he claimed it for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. His men stood behind him, witnesses to a moment that would echo far beyond their understanding. They were not alone. From the trees emerged the island's inhabitants. They watched quietly, their expressions curious, cautious, calm. They were the Taino people who had lived on these islands for generations. They wore little clothing, carried simple tools, and moved with ease through the land. Columbus described them as gentle and welcoming, unaware that his words would later be used to justify terrible actions. The first meetings were peaceful. Gifts were exchanged: bright beads, small bells, red caps. The Taino offered food and water. They pointed toward other islands. Columbus noticed gold ornaments worn by some of them, small but shining. His eyes followed the metal with intense focus. Gold, he believed, was the key to everything. In his journal, Columbus wrote with excitement. He described the beauty of the land, the kindness of the people, the promise of wealth. He believed he stood at the edge of Asia. He believed greater treasures lay just beyond the next island, the next horizon. And so, even as his men rested on solid ground for the first time in weeks, Columbus's mind was already moving forward, because this island, beautiful as it was only the beginning. And as the ships prepared to sail again through these strange new waters, unaware of the shadow their arrival would cast, Columbus felt certain that greater discoveries and greater consequences waited just ahead. The island of San Salvador rested quietly under the sun, unaware that history had just stepped onto its shore. For the men of Columbus's fleet, the land felt like a miracle. Solid ground beneath their feet, fresh water that did not taste of rot, fruit hanging heavy from trees, warm air carrying unfamiliar scents. After weeks of endless sea and fear, the island felt like a reward sent by God himself. But Columbus did not allow rest to become comfort. He was already thinking ahead. He believed, with absolute certainty, that he was sailing through the outer islands of Asia. Somewhere nearby, he was sure, lay cities filled with gold, ruled by powerful kings. He questioned the Taino people through gestures and broken communication, asking again and again about gold. Each time, they pointed vaguely toward other islands. To Columbus, this was proof that his calculations were correct, proof that his destiny was unfolding exactly as he had imagined. Within days, the ships were moving again. They sailed slowly, carefully, weaving between islands scattered like green jewels across the blue sea. Columbus named each one he encountered, marking them for Spain with confident strokes of ink in his journal. To him, naming was claiming. Each island became part of a growing vision, a network of lands that would bring wealth, power, and eternal fame. The Taino often approached the ships in canoes, curious and unafraid. They traded willingly, offering food, cotton, parrots, and small gold ornaments. Columbus observed them closely. He described their bodies, their tools, their weapons, or lack of them. He noted that they carried no iron swords, no armor. In his mind, this meant they would be easy to rule, easy to convert, easy to command. What he did not understand, or chose not to understand, was the depth of their world. The Taino had villages, leaders, beliefs, and stories shaped by centuries of life on these islands. Their calm was not weakness. Their generosity was not ignorance. But Columbus saw them only through the lens of his mission. As the fleet reached larger islands, Columbus's excitement grew. Then, on October 28, 1492, they approached a vast landmass with rivers, mountains, and dense forests stretching as far as the eye could see. Columbus believed he had reached the mainland of Asia. He named it Juana, later known as Cuba. Cuba was unlike anything the Europeans had seen. Rivers cut through the land like silver threads. Smoke rose gently from distant villages. The air felt alive, thick with sound and movement. Columbus sent small groups inland to explore. They returned with stories of fertile land, friendly people, and rumors of gold farther away. But the gold remained elusive. Instead, Columbus encountered something else: tobacco. The Taino showed the Spaniards how they dried leaves and inhaled the smoke. The Europeans watched in confusion and fascination as smoke curled from mouths and noses. Columbus noted it carefully, unaware that this strange plant would one day reshape economies and cultures across the world. As days passed, frustration began to creep in. Columbus expected riches. He expected signs of Asian kingdoms, silk, spices, cities of stone. Instead, he found wooden villages and simple tools. Still, he refused to doubt. He convinced himself that he had simply not gone far enough yet. From Cuba, the ships moved eastward again, toward another great island, Hispaniola. Hispaniola felt promising from the moment it appeared on the horizon. Its mountains rose high and sharp, Its valleys seemed deep and rich. Gold, Columbus believed, must be here. The Taino spoke of powerful local leaders, or caciques, who ruled different regions. Columbus imagined alliances, conversions, tribute. One night, as the Santa Maria sailed along the northern coast of Hispaniola, disaster struck. Columbus had retired to his cabin. The sea was calm. The night was quiet. A young cabin boy was left in charge of the helm. Slowly, almost gently, the ship drifted toward unseen danger. Then came the sound no sailor ever forgets, the grinding crack of wood against coral. The Santa Maria had run aground. Chaos erupted. Orders were shouted. Ropes were pulled. Water rushed in. The crew tried desperately to free the ship, but it was useless. The tide pushed her harder onto the reef. By morning, it was clear the flagship was lost. Columbus stood on the shore, staring at the broken remains of the ship that had carried him across the ocean. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed down on him. This was not part of the dream. This was not part of the plan. But Columbus adapted quickly. With the help of the local Taino, the crew salvaged what they could from the wreck. Wood from the Santa Maria was used to build a small fort on the island. Columbus named it La Navidad, after the Christmas season in which it was constructed. It was the first European settlement in the Americas. Columbus decided to leave men behind. 39 sailors volunteered or were chosen to stay at La Navidad. They were given instructions to gather gold, trade peacefully, and wait for his return. Columbus believed this outpost would secure Spain's claim and prove the success of his voyage. In January 1493, with only the Nina and the Pinta remaining, Columbus prepared to sail back to Spain. His ships were smaller now, his crew thinner, but his confidence burned brighter than ever. He carried exotic plants, unfamiliar animals, and several Taino people, taken to be shown to the Spanish court. As the sails filled and Hispaniola faded into the distance, Columbus felt triumphant. He believed he had changed the world. He believed he would return as a hero, rewarded with honor and authority beyond imagination. He did not know what fate awaited the men left behind at La Navidad. He did not know how Europe would react to his claims, and he did not yet understand that the greatest consequences of his voyage were not gold or glory, but a collision of worlds that would never be undone. As the ships turned eastward, facing a long and dangerous return across the Atlantic, the story of Columbus was far from finished. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The ocean felt different on the way back. When the Nina and the Pinta turned east toward Spain, the sea no longer represented mystery. It represented survival. The excitement of discovery had faded, replaced by exhaustion, damage, and uncertainty. The ships were smaller now, lighter without the Santa Maria, but also more vulnerable. Winter winds had begun to shift. The Atlantic, calm and steady on the way west, now showed its other face. Storms gathered without warning. Waves rose high and dark, slamming against wooden hulls that groaned under the pressure. The wind screamed through rigging, snapping ropes and tearing at sails. Water poured across the decks as sailors struggled to keep the ships upright. Every man on board understood how fragile their situation was. One broken mast, one torn sail, one mistake, and the ocean would swallow them whole. Columbus prayed constantly. He prayed aloud. He prayed silently. He promised pilgrimages, donations, acts of devotion, if God would only guide them home. At times, even his confidence seemed to bend beneath the storm clouds. The sea did not care about destiny or royal titles. It tested everyone equally. During one terrible storm, Columbus feared all was lost. The Niña was tossed like a leaf, disappearing between towering waves. Believing death was close, Columbus wrote a report of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and cast it into the sea. It was a final message to the world, a hope that even if he died, his voyage would not be forgotten. When the storm finally broke, the ships were separated. The Pinta vanished into the gray distance. Columbus had no way of knowing whether it had survived or sunk beneath the waves. Alone aboard the Niña, he continued east, following the stars and the instinct that had carried him this far. Weeks later, land appeared, but it was not Spain. The Niña had been blown north toward the coast of Portugal. Columbus entered the Tagus River cautiously, unsure how he would be received. Portugal had once rejected his plan. Now he arrived unexpectedly, carrying news that could change the balance of power in Europe. Portuguese authorities questioned him. Their king listened carefully as Columbus described the lands he had found, the people he had met, the wealth he believed waited across the sea. Some were impressed. Others were suspicious. Portugal had invested heavily in routes around Africa. Columbus's discovery threatened to challenge their advantage. After tense days, Columbus was allowed to leave. At last, in March of 1493, the Niña sailed into the Spanish port of Palos. Bells rang. Crowds gathered. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Christopher Columbus had returned, and he had not returned empty-handed. He brought strange plants, bright feathers, gold ornaments, and Taino people dressed and presented as proof of lands beyond imagination. People stared in awe and confusion. Some crossed themselves, unsure if what they were seeing was a miracle or something unnatural. Columbus rode to meet King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in triumph. The royal court received him with ceremony and wonder. He spoke with confidence and passion. He described islands overflowing with beauty, people who were gentle and welcoming, lands ripe for conversion. conversion, wealth, and expansion. He claimed he had reached the edges of Asia, opening a new route to the east that would make Spain rich beyond measure. The monarchs listened closely. Spain was hungry for power. Columbus's voyage promised everything they desired: gold, land, souls to convert, and a chance to outshine rival kingdoms. They rewarded him generously. His titles were confirmed. His reputation soared. Across Europe, word spread of a sailor who had crossed the ocean sea and returned alive. But not everyone believed his story. Some scholars questioned his geography. The lands he described did not match known accounts of Asia. The people, the plants, the animals, none of them fit the old books. Quiet doubts began to form, but doubt was weak compared to excitement. And excitement ruled the moment. Plans for a second voyage began almost immediately. This time, Columbus would not return with 3 small ships and a nervous crew. This time, he would return with power. Spain prepared a fleet unlike anything seen before. 17 ships, over 1,000 men, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, officials, horses, weapons, supplies for settlement, not just exploration. This was no longer a journey of curiosity. It was a mission of control. Columbus sailed again in September of 1493, carrying the weight of enormous expectations. He was no longer just an explorer. He was an admiral, a governor, a representative of empire. His orders were clear: establish permanent colonies, gather wealth, spread Christianity, and secure Spain's claim. When the fleet reached the Caribbean, Columbus expected joy. Instead, he found silence. He returned to Hispaniola and sailed to the site of La Navidad, the small fort built from the remains of the Santa Maria. Smoke did not rise from its chimneys. No voices greeted the ships. The shore was quiet in a way that felt wrong. As Columbus stepped onto land, dread settled in his chest. The fort was destroyed. The buildings were burned. Supplies were scattered. And the 39 men he had left behind were gone. Not a single survivor remained to tell the story of what had happened. The Taino nearby spoke of conflict, of cruelty, of Spaniards who had taken more than they were given. The truth emerged slowly, painfully. The men of La Navidad had abused their power. They had demanded gold, taken women, broken trust. The peace that once existed shattered, and violence followed. The settlement fell, and with it, the illusion that European presence would be simple or welcomed. Columbus stood among the ruins, facing the consequences of choices already set in motion. But he did not turn back. Instead, he ordered a new settlement built larger, stronger, more controlled. He named it La Isabela. It would be Spain's foothold in this new world. Soldiers patrolled. Fortifications rose. Rules were imposed. The age of gentle first contact was over. And as Columbus tightened his grip on the land and its people, believing he was fulfilling destiny, a darker chapter began to unfold, one that would transform discovery into domination and curiosity into conquest. What followed would reshape not only these islands, but the future of entire continents. La Isabela rose slowly from the soil of Hispaniola, built with ambition and desperation in equal measure. The land was hot, unfamiliar, and resistant to European plans. The soil did not behave like Spanish fields. The weather shifted suddenly, bringing heavy rains that turned paths into mud and dry heat that drained the strength from even the strongest men. Supplies spoiled, tools broke, food ran low faster than expected. The dream of an easy colony began to crack almost immediately. The settlers were not prepared for this life. Many were soldiers who expected quick victories and easy riches. Others were nobles who had never worked the land with their own hands. They argued, complained, and fell sick. Diseases spread through the camp, unfamiliar fevers that weakened bodies already strained by hunger and exhaustion. The Taino, who had once approached with curiosity, now watched from a distance, cautious and silent. Columbus ruled as governor with rigid authority. He believed discipline was the only way to survive. Orders were strict. Punishments were harsh. He demanded obedience not only from the indigenous people, but from his own men. Yet resentment grew on both sides. The Spaniards felt misled. The gold they were promised was scarce. The wealth of Asia seemed farther away than ever. Whispers spread through the settlement that Columbus was not the great leader they had believed him to be. To meet Spain's expectations, Columbus needed results. Gold above all else. He sent expeditions inland, forcing Taino communities to guide Spaniards through mountains and rivers in search of precious metal. When gold was found, even in small amounts, it was seized eagerly. When it was not, blame followed. The pressure to produce wealth turned daily life into a cycle of demand and fear. Columbus introduced a system of tribute. Taino adults were ordered to deliver a certain amount of gold regularly. Those who could not meet the quota were punished. Hands were cut. Bodies were scarred. Fear replaced curiosity entirely. The islands that once welcomed strangers now trembled beneath foreign rule. Resistance began to grow, quiet at first, then more organized as desperation overcame fear. The Spaniards responded with force. Steel swords against wooden weapons, armor against bare skin. Horses, unknown to the Taino, charged through villages like living storms. Dogs trained for war were unleashed. Battles were short and brutal. Victory always favored the newcomers. Columbus recorded these events not as tragedies, but as necessary steps toward order and control. Meanwhile, divisions deepened within the Spanish camp itself. Some settlers openly accused Columbus and his brothers of misrule. They claimed the colony was failing because of poor leadership. Reports of cruelty and mismanagement traveled back to Spain, carried by ships heavy with complaints instead of gold. The image of Columbus as a heroic discoverer began to blur. Still, Columbus refused to doubt his mission. He believed the hardships were temporary, that greater rewards lay ahead. He continued exploring nearby islands, naming them, claiming them, searching endlessly for signs that would prove he had reached Asia. Each voyage strengthened his belief, but weakened the colony left behind. As years passed, the population of the Taino declined rapidly. Disease spread faster than violence ever could. Illnesses carried unknowingly by Europeans swept through villages with terrifying speed. Entire communities vanished. Fields went untended. Traditions faded. Songs were no longer sung. What had taken centuries to build began to disappear in a generation. Columbus noticed the decline, but did not fully grasp its scale. His focus remained fixed on reports, routes, and royal expectations. To him, the islands were resources to be organized, not living worlds collapsing under pressure. When labor ran short, he approved the shipment of Taino captives to Spain, believing they could be sold or trained. Many died during the crossing, their bodies lost to the same ocean that had once carried Columbus's dreams. Back in Spain, the mood shifted. At first, Columbus's voyages had inspired wonder. Now they raised questions. Gold shipments were smaller than promised. Reports of cruelty grew louder. Queen Isabella, deeply religious, became uneasy with stories of abuse against newly encountered peoples. Spain wanted an empire, but it also wanted order, control, and results. Royal officials were sent to investigate. They arrived in Hispaniola and saw a colony strained to its breaking point. Settlers starving, indigenous people suffering, authority fractured by fear and resentment. Columbus, once admired for his courage, now appeared rigid, distant, and overwhelmed. His belief in destiny no longer inspired confidence. It frightened those who watched him rule. The investigation ended with a shocking decision. Columbus was arrested. Chains were placed on the man who had crossed the Atlantic against all odds. He was sent back to Spain not as a triumphant admiral, but as a prisoner. The ocean he had conquered now carried him home in silence, bound and disgraced. Yet, even in chains, Columbus believed. He believed history would remember him kindly. He believed his suffering would be seen as sacrifice. He believed the lands he had revealed would one day prove his greatness beyond doubt. As the ships approached Europe once more, carrying a fallen hero instead of a celebrated one, the future of Columbus and the fate of the world he had changed forever remained uncertain, waiting to unfold in ways one could yet fully understand. The chains around Christopher Columbus's wrists were heavy, but not as heavy as the silence that surrounded him on the voyage back to Spain. The man who had once stood proudly before kings now sat quietly on deck, staring at the sea that had both raised him and broken him. Sailors avoided his eyes. Some felt pity, others felt anger. To many, he was no longer a hero, just a reminder of promises that had turned into suffering. When the ship reached Spain, the sight of Columbus in chains shocked the public. Word spread quickly. People gathered along the docks, whispering and pointing. This was not how legends were supposed to return. Columbus requested that the chains not be removed. He insisted on wearing them as proof of injustice, as a symbol of betrayal by those he had served. In his mind, the chains would one day speak louder than any accusation. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were surprised by his arrest. Whatever Columbus's failures, he was still the man who had opened the Western Ocean to Spain. After hearing his account, they ordered his release. The chains were removed, but the damage was done. Columbus's authority was weakened. His reputation, once shining, was now cracked with doubt. Yet Columbus did not retreat into silence. He argued passionately that his discoveries outweighed his mistakes. He blamed others for the chaos in Hispaniola. Disloyal settlers, greedy men, weak officials. He painted himself as a visionary, misunderstood by those too small-minded to grasp the scale of his mission. The monarchs listened carefully. Spain was already benefiting from the lands he had revealed. Whatever Columbus's flaws, the door he had opened could not be closed. Against the advice of many, Columbus was granted one more chance, a fourth voyage. This time, however, he would not govern colonies. He would not rule people. His mission was clear and limited. Find a western passage to Asia. Find a strait that would lead to the riches of the East. Prove once and for all that his vision had been correct from the beginning. In 1502, Columbus set sail again. Older now, his body weakened by years of hardship and illness. Arthritis twisted his joints. His eyesight had begun to fail, but his mind burned with the same fire as before. He was accompanied by his sons, a small fleet, and a determination sharpened by humiliation. The Caribbean greeted him with familiar beauty and familiar danger. Storms followed him like shadows. Currents fought against his ships. Warnings reached him from other Spaniards to avoid Hispaniola, but Columbus ignored them. He believed he had earned the right to land wherever he chose. The sea answered his defiance with violence. A massive hurricane struck. Ships were torn apart. Waves rose like walls. Columbus's vessels barely survived, battered and leaking. He took shelter where he could, repairing damage with whatever materials were available. The storm delayed him, weakened his fleet, and reminded him that even now, The ocean was not under his command. Still, he pressed on. Columbus sailed along the coasts of Central America, exploring regions now known as Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Dense jungles pressed close to the shoreline. Rivers poured into the sea with powerful force. The land felt ancient and heavy, filled with secrets. Indigenous communities lived along these coasts, trading goods and moving with confidence through their environment. Here, Columbus encountered something that reignited his hope: gold. Local traders wore gold ornaments and spoke of regions farther inland where the metal was more abundant. Columbus's excitement surged. He believed he was close to the passage he sought, the narrow link between oceans that would finally lead him to Asia. He searched relentlessly, sailing south, questioning locals, examining every coastline for signs of a strait. But the passage never appeared. Instead, his ships began to fail. Wood rotted under constant moisture. Worms bored into hulls, weakening them from within. Leaks became constant. Food supplies dwindled. His crew grew desperate, angry, and afraid. Many believed the voyage was cursed. They accused Columbus of leading them into endless suffering driven by obsession rather than reason. Then disaster struck again. On the coast of Jamaica, Columbus's ships finally gave up. One by one, they became unseaworthy. With no choice left, Columbus ordered them beached. The fleet that had once crossed the Atlantic lay broken on a foreign shore, unable to move forward or return home. Stranded. For months, Columbus and his men lived among the local indigenous population. At first, relations were peaceful. The people brought food, curious but cautious. Columbus used his knowledge of astronomy to impress them, predicting a lunar eclipse and presenting it as a sign of divine power. When supplies began to slow, fear restored cooperation, but trust was gone. Time stretched endlessly. Columbus's health deteriorated. His body ached constantly. Fever came and went. His mind, however, refused to surrender. He wrote letters to the Spanish crown, describing his suffering, his loyalty, his belief that history would judge him fairly. He painted himself as a faithful servant abandoned by fortune, but not by faith. Eventually, rescue came. A ship arrived to carry Columbus and the survivors back to Hispaniola, and from there, back to Spain. The journey home was quiet, filled with reflection and exhaustion. Columbus knew his days as an explorer were over. The ocean that had once opened itself to him now felt distant, closed. When he reached Spain in 1504, the world had changed again. Queen Isabella was dying. The court's attention had shifted. New explorers were sailing west, building on the path Columbus had opened, often without mentioning his name. The lands he had revealed were no longer mysteries. They were becoming empires. Columbus, once at the center of everything, now now stood at the edge. Yet even as his body failed, his belief never did. He remained convinced that he had reached Asia, that the lands he found were part of the East, that history would eventually recognize the truth of his vision. He died in 1506, not knowing that he had encountered an entirely unknown world, not the edges of an old one. And while his life ended in quiet disappointment, the consequences of his journeys were only beginning to unfold, spreading outward across oceans and centuries, shaping a future far greater and far darker than Columbus himself could ever have imagined. Even after Columbus's death in 1506, the world he had touched continued to pulse with change, a rhythm set in motion by the daring crossing of an unknown ocean. The lands he called the Indies were not the edges of Asia, as he had believed, but entire continents, brimming with life, civilizations, and resources beyond European imagination. Hispaniola, Cuba, and the surrounding islands were alive with people whose lives had been altered forever. The Taino, Arawak, and other indigenous communities began to feel the first tremors of a transformation that would stretch across generations. The initial encounter had been one of curiosity and cautious hospitality, but the shadow of conquest was already falling. The arrival of Columbus had introduced weapons, diseases, and social upheaval, forces invisible yet more powerful than any army. The Europeans, fueled by the promise of gold and glory, returned with increasing frequency. Every expedition that crossed the Atlantic carried more men, more weapons, and more expectations. The crown of Spain, now convinced that immense wealth lay in the Americas, poured resources into new fleets. Cities, forts, and plantations began to take shape along coasts and rivers, often built atop the ruins of indigenous villages. The pace of colonization was relentless. Europeans moved inland with a sense of destiny, often unaware or indifferent to the civilizations that had existed for centuries. Their worldview treated the land as empty or waiting to be claimed, ignoring the rich social, spiritual, and political lives of the people who lived there. Disease was the invisible conqueror. Smallpox, measles, influenza illnesses carried unknowingly by Europeans spread like wildfire. Entire villages collapsed within weeks. Populations that had thrived for centuries were decimated. The Taino population on Hispaniola, once numbering in the hundreds of thousands, fell dramatically within a single decade. Survivors were often forced into labor to satisfy Spanish demands for gold, food, and construction. It was a cycle of survival, domination, and despair, one that Columbus had begun, and one that would continue long after his voyages. Every tree felled, every path cleared, every mine dug reshaped the islands, creating a landscape that was part human ambition, part tragedy. The Europeans brought more than disease. They brought new social structures, religions, and political hierarchies. Priests and missionaries followed the explorers, eager to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. Churches were erected. Prayers were sung in languages that were not native to the land, and rituals were performed over landscapes that had been sacred for generations. The imposition of European culture clashed violently with existing traditions, creating tension and confusion. Many indigenous communities attempted to adapt, finding ways to incorporate new beliefs with old ones. Others resisted, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, in acts of defiance that were subtle but powerful. The islands became a stage for the collision of civilizations, a place where old worlds met new, and neither would ever remain the same. Meanwhile, the flow of wealth to Europe began to accelerate. Columbus's initial promise of gold had been modest compared to the plunder that followed. Mines were discovered and exploited. Plantations were established to produce sugar, cotton, and other crops for European markets. The forced labor of indigenous people was supplemented, eventually, by the importation of enslaved Africans, a practice that would reshape economies and societies on a global scale. Trade routes expanded across the Atlantic. Cities such as Seville became hubs of wealth, power, and bureaucratic oversight. Their fortunes built on the resources extracted from distant lands. The Atlantic Ocean, once a boundary, became a highway of commerce and conquest. Even as Spain grew in power, tensions rose within the colonies. Governance was difficult over such vast distances. Letters and orders took months to reach their destinations. Local officials often acted in their own interests, sometimes exploiting the indigenous population, sometimes clashing with one another over land and gold. Columbus himself had experienced these challenges firsthand, but the system he had begun would evolve into larger structures of colonial rule that were often more rigid, more brutal, and less forgiving. Native populations were caught between European ambitions and internal pressures, forced into choices they could not control. Despite the suffering, the Americas were also a place of incredible exchange and adaptation. Europeans encountered plants, animals, and food that would forever change life in the Old World. Corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao traveled east across the ocean, transforming agriculture, cuisine, and economies in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Similarly, horses, cattle, and other domesticated animals altered landscapes and indigenous ways of life. The Columbian Exchange, as historians would later call it, was a flood of biology, culture, and knowledge, reshaping continents on a scale almost unimaginable at the time. Every voyage, every settlement, every encounter accelerated the intertwining of two worlds previously separate by oceans. But connected now through ambition, curiosity, and force. The psychological impact of Columbus's voyages cannot be overstated. For Europe, it was a revelation, a confirmation that the world was larger and more mysterious than previously believed, but also that it could be explored, controlled, and exploited. The sense of possibility was intoxicating. Monarchs dreamed of empires, merchants dreamed of profits, and explorers dreamed of immortal fame. Navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography advanced rapidly to meet these dreams. Maps that had once shown monsters and blank spaces were replaced with detailed coastlines, rivers, and islands. The Atlantic became a bridge rather than a barrier, linking continents and peoples in ways that would continue to grow over centuries. For the indigenous populations, the psychological toll was profound and immediate. The world they had known, its rhythms, its traditions, its balance, was disrupted almost overnight. Their societies were pushed to adapt, resist, or perish. Alliances shifted. New hierarchies were imposed. Spiritual practices had to contend with foreign beliefs and the coercive power of European authority. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of ships, soldiers, and foreign rulers. And yet, amidst tragedy, pockets of resilience survived. Stories, languages, customs, and traditions were preserved in secret or transformed to endure. The human spirit, though battered, proved remarkably adaptable. By the middle of the 16th century, the Americas had been transformed. Columbus's initial voyages had set off a chain reaction that reached far beyond the islands of the Caribbean. Spain had claimed vast territories, establishing colonies across the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Other European powers, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands, began their own expeditions, drawn by the promise of wealth and influence. Conflicts arose not only with indigenous populations, but between rival European nations, each trying to stake a claim in the New World. The Atlantic was now crowded with ships, each a symbol of ambition, greed, and curiosity, carrying people, goods, and ideas across vast, unpredictable waters. And yet, the shadow of Columbus remained, looming over everything. He had been flawed, proud, and sometimes ruthless. He had misjudged the lands he discovered and underestimated the consequences of his actions. But he had opened the door to a new world. He had crossed the ocean when almost everyone else feared to step into the unknown. His voyages became the first chapter of a story that would reshape the globe economically, politically, socially, and culturally. He was both hero and villain, visionary and oppressor, a man whose dreams collided violently with the reality of the lives he touched. The ocean itself, once a boundary, had become a stage for humanity's ambitions, tragedies, and transformations. The islands of the Caribbean, were no longer isolated worlds, but part of a vast, interconnected system of exchange and conquest. Peoples, resources, diseases, and ideas flowed back and forth across the Atlantic, creating a network that would define the modern world. Every corner of the globe was now linked, and it all began with a single voyage into the unknown, with the hope of reaching Asia and the courage to sail into uncertainty. As the world adjusted to this new reality, one question lingered. How would the centuries that followed interpret this collision of worlds? Would it be seen as discovery, conquest, tragedy, or opportunity? History itself, like the ocean, was vast, unpredictable, and relentless, and the answers would unfold slowly across continents and generations. The story that Columbus had begun was no longer his alone. It belonged to the Americas, to Europe, to every life touched by the crossing of that first ocean, and to the future, yet unwritten. And as new explorers set sail into unknown waters, the legacy of Columbus stretched forward, carrying with it both the light of discovery and the shadow of consequence, ready to shape the fate of the world in ways no one could fully imagine. The years following Columbus's voyages were a time of unrelenting change, of turbulence and transformation in the islands and coasts of the Caribbean and beyond. Hispaniola, once a land of relative abundance and natural harmony, had become a place of tension, expectation, and fear. The Taino and Arawak peoples, who had greeted Columbus and his men with curiosity and generosity, now faced the full weight of European intrusion. Their villages were burned or repurposed. Their rivers and forests, once navigable and free, were marked by roads, forts, and settlements built by people who neither understood nor respected the natural rhythm of the land. They had witnessed the arrival of strange, towering ships, men clad in iron and wielding swords, and animals, horses and dogs, that defied comprehension. The world as they knew it was changing faster than they could adapt, and each day brought a new encounter that could be fatal. Spain, meanwhile, was consolidating its newfound power in the Americas. The Spanish crown had recognized that mere exploration was not enough to secure influence over vast, distant lands. Colonies needed structure, authority, and oversight. Governors were appointed, administrations established. Laws were drafted to govern interactions with indigenous populations, though enforcement was uneven at best. The encomienda system began to take shape, a framework in which indigenous people were assigned to Spanish settlers, who demanded labor, tribute, and obedience. The promise of protection was often empty. The reality of exploitation was absolute. Families were torn apart. Children were forced into work at a young age. Villages were depopulated. Gold and other resources flowed steadily back to Spain, but at a human cost that was staggering and often invisible to European eyes. Despite the suffering, not all resistance was futile. The indigenous peoples learned quickly to adapt to the new circumstances. Guerrilla tactics, strategic withdrawals, and the careful observation of European behavior allowed some communities to survive longer than others. In the dense forests and high mountains of Hispaniola, small groups would hide from the colonists, sometimes striking back with arrows or ambushes when the opportunity arose. These acts of defiance, while limited by the overwhelming technology and organization of the Europeans, were a testament to resilience. They revealed that conquest was not merely a matter of ships and weapons, but also of persistence, intelligence, and willpower. In the broader Atlantic, the ripple effects of Columbus's voyages were becoming impossible to ignore. Merchants and adventurers across Europe took notice. Maps were redrawn. Sea routes were planned with precision. Spain's rivals, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, intensified their own expeditions, seeking to claim lands, establish trade, and challenge Spanish dominance. Each new voyage carried men who had learned from Columbus's success and mistakes alike. The technology of navigation improved rapidly. Ships were built larger, stronger, and faster. Sailors trained longer and learned to chart the seas with increasing accuracy. The Atlantic, once an unknown expanse feared by mariners, became a corridor of commerce, conflict, and colonization. At the same time, Europe itself was experiencing profound changes. The Renaissance had brought a thirst for knowledge, for exploration, for discovery. Columbus's journeys amplified this curiosity, turning abstract ideas into tangible possibility. Tales of islands rich with gold, of peoples unlike any Europeans had seen, and of lands filled with plants and animals that defied description, filled the courts, taverns, and workshops of the continent. Artists, writers, and scientists began to document these wonders, translating encounters into images and accounts that would inspire generations. The world beyond the Atlantic, once distant and mysterious, became part of a shared imagination, fueling ambition, greed, and intellectual inquiry in equal measure. Yet, while the narratives in Europe often celebrated discovery and adventure, the reality on the ground in the Americas was far harsher. The rapid collapse of indigenous populations due to disease alone was catastrophic. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses spread at unprecedented speed, claiming lives by the thousands. The psychological trauma was immense. Survivors watched families, friends, and entire communities vanish in weeks. Agricultural knowledge, oral histories, and cultural traditions were lost. And with the influx of European settlers, the social structures that had sustained communities for centuries were dismantled or forcibly replaced. In their place emerged a hierarchy dictated by foreign laws, military power, and economic exploitation. Amidst this transformation, the flow of wealth to Europe grew steadily. Gold, silver, spices, and other resources enriched Spain, creating powerful merchant families and strengthening the monarchy. Cities like Seville became global hubs, linking the Americas, Europe, and Asia in a network of trade that was unprecedented in scale. This economic surge fueled further voyages, colonies, and conquests. But it also deepened inequalities, both across the Atlantic and within the colonies themselves. Spaniards competed for land and influence. Corruption and abuse were rampant. The lives of indigenous peoples and African slaves became the foundation upon which a new empire was built, often hidden behind the facade of law and religion. Columbus's personal legacy was both celebrated and complicated during this period. While some remembered him as the visionary who had opened the seas to Europe, others critiqued his governance, his harsh treatment of settlers, and the suffering he had indirectly caused among indigenous populations. His mistakes were magnified by the fact that the structures he created, the encomienda system, the settlements, the push for extraction of wealth, continued and expanded after his death. Future explorers built upon his discoveries, often surpassing him in ambition and ruthlessness. But the mark of Columbus's first voyages remained visible in every Spanish colony, in every map drawn across the Caribbean, and in every European account of the New World. Meanwhile, the Caribbean itself continued to change rapidly. Hurricanes, tropical storms, and unpredictable weather patterns tested every settlement. Indigenous knowledge of the land and climate was invaluable, but often ignored. The Europeans were learning slowly, sometimes painfully, that survival in these regions required adaptation, not domination alone. Trade with local communities became essential. Crops from Europe were introduced, changing agricultural practices. Livestock, such as horses and cattle, altered landscapes and social dynamics. Forests were cleared for plantations and settlements. Rivers, once free-flowing, were dammed or diverted to serve European needs. The physical environment itself began to reflect the presence of a new power, leaving traces that persist to this day. By the middle of the 16th century, the scale of transformation was staggering. What had begun as a single daring voyage under the command of Columbus had become the foundation for an empire spanning islands, coasts, and continents. Entire societies had been disrupted, restructured, or destroyed. New global networks of trade, migration, and cultural exchange were emerging. The Americas were no longer isolated. They were deeply entwined with Europe, Africa, and Asia in ways that were only beginning to be understood. Diseases, crops, animals, humans, and ideas crossed the Atlantic with with increasing speed and volume, linking worlds in ways impossible to imagine before 1492. Yet even amidst all this change, the human element remained central. Stories of courage, resilience, betrayal, adaptation, and survival multiplied. The indigenous peoples resisted, adapted, and endured. The European settlers competed, explored, and exploited. The ocean continued to connect distant lands, shaping destinies in ways no one could fully predict. Columbus's voyages had sparked not just a geographical shift, but a psychological and cultural revolution. They revealed the fragility of human societies, the hunger for wealth and power, and the astonishing capacity of individuals to alter the course of history. And as new generations of explorers, settlers, and indigenous peoples navigated this transformed world, the echoes of Columbus's first journey across the Atlantic continued to resonate, shaping encounters, ambitions, and conflicts for centuries to come. His voyage was no longer an isolated event. It was the opening chapter of a story that would span continents, empires, and centuries. A story that would be written in blood, gold, and the relentless currents of the Atlantic itself. The world had been irrevocably altered, and the consequences of Columbus's daring, reckless, and visionary journey were only beginning to unfold. Across the Caribbean islands, the forests, rivers, and mountains whispered of change. The Taino and other indigenous communities learned quickly that survival demanded intelligence, courage, and flexibility. The Europeans discovered that ambition alone could not tame the land or the sea, and the Atlantic Ocean, vast and unyielding, remained the stage upon which the drama of discovery, conquest, and resistance would continue to unfold in ways both spectacular and tragic. This was the world of the early Americas after Columbus, a world caught between wonder and horror, between possibility and devastation, a world forever transformed by one man's decision to sail west into the unknown, carrying with him the hopes of Europe and the fates of millions who had called these islands home long before the first ship appeared on the horizon. The story of Columbus was no longer simply about the man, nor even the voyages themselves. It had become a story of consequence, of interconnected fates, and of a world forever changed by courage, curiosity, and ambition, leaving all who followed to navigate the legacy he had set in motion. As the 16th century progressed, the Americas became a place of constant motion, tension, and transformation, a vast stage where the ambitions of Europe collided with the lives of indigenous peoples in ways both violent and subtle. The islands that Columbus first touched were no longer isolated corners of the world. They had become interconnected hubs in an emerging global system. Ships crossed the Atlantic with increasing regularity, bringing soldiers, settlers, priests, merchants, and enslaved people Each voyage carried new knowledge, new tools, new diseases, and new desires. The ocean itself seemed to hum with movement, a liquid highway connecting continents and empires. The Caribbean, once a mosaic of independent communities, was now a crucible in which cultures, economies, and ecologies were forced to interact, often with devastating consequences. The indigenous populations continued to bear the brunt of this transformation. Communities that had once thrived for centuries faced relentless pressure from multiple directions. Disease continued its invisible march, decimating villages and undermining social structures. Tribes struggled to maintain their traditions as forced labor, displacement, and violence reshaped daily life. Some sought to adapt, adopting European tools, learning foreign languages, or forming alliances with certain settlers for protection. Others resisted openly, organizing raids against Spanish settlements, sabotaging plantations, or fleeing into forests and mountains. Yet the technology and organization of the Europeans often proved overwhelming. Guns, steel, armor, and horses provided an advantage that could not easily be countered with arrows or spears alone. The psychological toll was immense. As survivors witnessed the destruction of their world and the erosion of their histories, for the Europeans, the Americas represented opportunity and risk in equal measure. The promise of gold, spices, and fertile land drove men and women to risk death at sea and struggle against harsh climates, disease, and resistance from local populations. Settlers learned slowly, painfully, that the islands were not empty landscapes, but complex ecosystems that demanded knowledge and adaptation. Crops failed, rivers flooded, and hurricanes destroyed settlements, reminding Europeans that the land was not theirs to command entirely. Yet, with every failure, they adapted. Agriculture was adjusted, buildings were fortified, and new trade networks emerged. Spaniards began to rely not only on force, but also on negotiation, alliances, and coercion, creating a delicate balance of power that shifted constantly across the islands. Trade networks expanded rapidly. Spain became the center of a transatlantic economy, linking Europe, the Americas, and eventually Africa in unprecedented ways. Gold and silver flowed into Seville, funding wars, art, and exploration. Sugar plantations multiplied, bringing wealth to settlers while relying on the forced labor of indigenous people and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. Trade routes carried not only goods, but ideas, plants, animals, and diseases, reshaping societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Cities in Europe flourished as a result, while the Caribbean islands became sites of extraction, settlement, and experimentation. The flow of wealth, however, was uneven and often violent, built on the suffering of countless individuals whose labor and lives were exploited. Amid these changes, cultural exchanges occurred in unexpected ways. Indigenous people learned European techniques for building, farming, and navigation. Even as Europeans learned to survive in the tropics by adopting local knowledge of plants, climate, and geography, languages, customs, and spiritual beliefs blended in subtle ways, though often under duress. Children born of mixed heritage, later called mestizos, symbolized the first generation of a new, hybrid society. In towns and ports, markets emerged where European, African, and indigenous goods and knowledge intersected. The Americas were no longer a distant unknown. They were living laboratories of human adaptation, culture, and survival. The shadow of conquest stretched across the islands. The Caribbean became a proving ground for Spain's colonial ambitions, a place where the lessons of Hispaniola were applied and refined. Forts were erected to defend against both indigenous uprisings and rival European powers. Missions were established to convert populations to Christianity, often by force, as spiritual authority became intertwined with political and economic control. The social hierarchy hardened, dividing settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans into rigid strata. Violence and coercion became common tools of governance. Yet these measures could never fully suppress resistance. Stories of rebellion, sabotage, and escape circulated widely, reminding the colonists that the people whose lands they occupied were not passive subjects. At the same time, the idea of the New World captured the European imagination like never before. Artists painted scenes of tropical landscapes, indigenous peoples, and exotic flora and fauna. Writers recorded tales of adventure, danger, and opportunity. Cartographers updated maps with each voyage, gradually filling in coastlines, rivers, and islands once blank on European charts. The Atlantic Ocean, once feared for its vast emptiness, had become a conduit of discovery, trade, and conquest. Knowledge flowed as rapidly as goods, creating a sense that the world itself was shrinking even as it grew larger in complexity. Yet, for all the growth and opportunity, danger remained constant. Hurricanes tore through settlements, destroying homes, crops, and ships. Pirates and privateers preyed on trade routes, threatening both wealth and life. Disease remained a relentless killer, cutting down communities with terrifying speed. Political rivalries among European powers added tension, as Spain, Portugal, France, and England all sought to stake their claims in the Americas. Every journey carried risk. Every settlement teetered on the edge of disaster. And every policy enacted by colonial governors affected thousands of lives in unpredictable ways. In this turbulent context, Columbus's legacy continued to resonate. He had opened the door to a world that few in Europe had imagined. But the consequences of his actions rippled far beyond his control. The colonies that followed built upon his voyages, yet often surpassed him in ambition and ruthlessness. The systems of labor, trade, and governance that emerged were shaped by the challenges he faced and the mistakes he made. His name remained both celebrated and contested, remembered as a visionary explorer by some, and as a figure whose ambition and decisions had unleashed suffering on countless people. The Caribbean islands, now a network of colonies, plantations, and settlements, became the epicenter of this unfolding story. Life there was intense, brutal, and transformative. European settlers learned to survive in a hostile climate. Indigenous people adapted, resisted, or fled. African slaves arrived, adding new dimensions to the labor system and social fabric. Economies developed around gold, sugar, and trade, while cities grew into administrative centers of empire. The islands were no longer merely points on a map. They were dynamic, contested spaces where power, culture, and survival collided daily. By the late 16th century, the Americas were no longer a distant dream, but a central stage in global history. The Atlantic had become a thoroughfare connecting continents, cultures, and economies. The consequences of Columbus's voyages were clear. Empires were born, societies were reshaped, and the lives of millions were forever altered. The islands he first set foot on had become symbols of opportunity, tragedy, and transformation. The world had expanded, not just geographically, but culturally, politically, and economically. And yet, despite all that had changed, the oceans still held secrets. Unknown lands, untamed forests, hidden rivers, and unexplored coasts continued to challenge those who dared to cross them. The story of discovery was far from complete. The consequences of Columbus's voyages were still unfolding, shaping not only the Caribbean, but the entire globe in ways that no one alive at the time could fully predict. History itself seemed to pause and watch as the lives of the conquered, the conquerors, and those yet to arrive were drawn into a drama that spanned oceans, generations, and continents. The age of exploration, ignited by Columbus's daring westward voyage, was only beginning. Each new ship that sailed from Europe carried ambition, curiosity, and the potential for both creation and destruction. Each new settlement expanded the web of human influence across the Americas, while also testing the limits of resilience, adaptation, and survival. And beneath it all, the Caribbean, once a place of quiet islands and gentle coasts, had become a crucible, a place where history was being rewritten in fire, blood, and determination, and where the true consequences of discovery were only beginning to reveal themselves. The story of the Americas, sparked by Columbus, was no longer a story of a single man or a single voyage. It had become a vast, unfolding epic, one that would stretch across oceans, centuries, and continents. A story of ambition and conquest, of survival and loss, of discovery and devastation. And as the next generations looked to the horizon, new explorers, settlers, and empires would continue to write the chapters of this world, forever bound to the legacy of that first daring crossing of the Atlantic. By the turn of the 17th century, the Americas were no longer distant. Exotic lands whispered about in European courts and taverns. They had become the center of a global stage where empires collided, cultures intertwined, and the fates of millions were reshaped in ways that would echo for centuries. The islands Columbus had first set foot upon Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the surrounding archipelagos had been transformed beyond recognition. Settlements now sprawled along coasts. Rivers were diverted for agriculture and transportation. And forests, once thick and impenetrable, were cleared to make way for plantations and towns. The landscape itself had become a canvas upon which the ambitions of Europe were painted. A mixture of order, exploitation, and unanticipated chaos. The indigenous populations were struggling to survive amidst these changes. Diseases, relentless and invisible, continued their devastating march. Smallpox, influenza, and measles tore through villages, leaving survivors in shock, grief, and disarray. Families that had existed for generations vanished almost overnight. Elders, the keepers of stories, histories, and traditions, were among the first to succumb, leaving younger generations to navigate a world reshaped by foreigners. Yet even in the face of this devastation, resilience remained. Indigenous people adapted, fleeing into forests, mountains, and remote valleys. They created hidden communities where traditions could survive in secret. Resistance evolved from sporadic attacks to organized campaigns. As some groups began to reclaim lost autonomy through cunning strategies, knowledge of the land, and unity born from necessity, European settlers, meanwhile, continued to expand, driven by the dual forces of ambition and necessity. Gold remained the primary motivation for many, but sugar, tobacco, and other lucrative crops quickly became pillars of the emerging colonial economy. Labor shortages, exacerbated by disease and resistance, led to the importation of enslaved Africans, creating a new, deeply entrenched system of exploitation. Plantation economies grew, feeding the coffers of Spain and enriching individual settlers. Yet these systems were built on violence, coercion, and unimaginable suffering. Cities like Santo Domingo on Hispaniola became administrative centers, bustling with activity, law courts, churches, and marketplaces. These urban hubs were the engines of empire, reflecting the organizational power of the Spanish crown, while also serving as sites of contestation rebellion, and negotiation. Cultural exchanges, forced, reluctant, and accidental, transformed the social fabric of the islands. Europeans learned survival techniques from indigenous people, adapting agricultural practices, diet, and shelter to suit tropical climates. Conversely, indigenous people were compelled to navigate the Spanish legal system, adopt foreign religions, and engage with new forms of economic exchange. Mixed-race populations, including mestizos and mulattoes, began to emerge, representing the first generations of hybrid societies born from conquest, survival, and necessity. These communities carried within them the legacies of both the colonizers and the colonized, living reminders of a world in transition. Religion became a central instrument of control. Missionaries, both zealous and pragmatic, spread Christianity aggressively, seeking to convert the indigenous populations. Churches were erected in the center of towns. Schools were established to teach European values and literacy, and rituals were mandated that conflicted with native practices. Yet these impositions did not go uncontested. Many indigenous people continued to practice their own spiritual traditions in secret or found ways to merge Christian practices with native beliefs, creating syncretic forms of worship that reflected the complexity of their new reality. Religion, which had been a personal and communal force for centuries, became intertwined with political power, labor, and social hierarchy, further complicating the dynamics of control and resistance. Trade networks expanded dramatically across the Atlantic. Gold, silver, sugar, and other commodities were shipped in unprecedented volumes to Spain, financing European wars, patronage of the arts, and the growth of cities. At the same time, new goods from the Americas, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco, revolutionized agriculture, diets, and economies across Europe, Asia, and Africa. This massive exchange of flora, fauna, and resources, later termed the Columbian Exchange, reshaped the planet in ways no one at the time could have fully comprehended. The Americas were no longer isolated. They were integrated into a global system of commerce, culture, and conflict, linking continents in a network that was unequal, exploitative, and transformative. Amid this rapid change, the human stories were vast and often tragic. Families were torn apart, leaders were displaced, and entire ways of life were lost. Yet, amidst suffering, courage persisted. Stories of rebellion, survival, and negotiation filled the islands. Indigenous leaders organized resistance, sometimes successfully, using intimate knowledge of the land to outmaneuver European forces. Enslaved Africans preserved elements of culture, language, and religion, blending them with local and European influences to create new traditions that would endure. Settlers, too, faced hardship, disease, hurricanes, hostile terrain, and the constant threat of conflict tested their resolve daily. Life in the Caribbean was a crucible shaping character, forging resilience, and forcing adaptation in every sphere of existence. The political landscape of the Americas also evolved in ways Columbus could scarcely have imagined. Spain's authority was both centralized and contested. Governors wielded significant power locally, often acting with autonomy, sometimes in defiance of royal orders. Corruption and intrigue were common, as men vied for gold, land, and influence. Interpersonal rivalries could erupt into open conflict, and alliances with indigenous groups shifted constantly, depending on immediate needs and threats. The Caribbean became a stage of power struggles, where ambition, cunning, and violence intersected, shaping the emerging social and political order in profound ways. The environmental impact of European colonization also became increasingly apparent. Forests were cleared for agriculture, settlements, and mining, fundamentally altering landscapes. Rivers were dammed or redirected. Native flora and fauna were displaced or exploited. Introduced species, such as pigs, horses, and cattle, transformed ecosystems, often with irreversible consequences. The delicate balance of the islands, honed over millennia, was disrupted. The Caribbean became a laboratory of environmental change, where human ambition collided with natural forces, leaving scars on the land as well as on the people who depended on it. Yet even as destruction spread, curiosity, wonder, and ambition drove further exploration. Maps became increasingly detailed, documenting coastlines, rivers, and islands that had been unknown mere decades earlier. Explorers sought passages to Asia, hoping to replicate or surpass Columbus's daring voyage. Merchants sought new trade routes and resources. Settlers carved homes, farms, and towns from the wilderness. And through all of it, the Atlantic remained both a highway and a barrier, unpredictable, dangerous, and awe-inspiring, a constant reminder of the vastness of the world and the audacity required to traverse it. By now, Columbus's shadow loomed large over these events. Though dead, he was remembered as both hero and cautionary tale, a man whose courage and vision opened a new world, but whose ambition unleashed suffering, conflict, and profound cultural disruption. His voyages had irrevocably changed the Americas, initiating a chain of events that transformed ecosystems, societies, and economies. Entire generations were born into a world reshaped by the consequences of his decisions. A world where the line between discovery and conquest, between hope and devastation, was thin and ever-shifting. The Caribbean, once a cluster of tranquil islands, had become the epicenter of empire, ambition, and resistance. Every village, river, and coastline bore the marks of change. Indigenous societies struggled to survive. European settlers carved out footholds, and African slaves were brought into this turbulent system, adding layers of complexity, resilience, and suffering. The islands became microcosms of global history, spaces where human ambition, curiosity, and cruelty collided, often with unpredictable results. And yet, despite all the upheaval, the promise of the New World continued to captivate imaginations. Tales of gold, adventure, and discovery spread through Europe, inspiring new expeditions, inspiring new settlers, and fueling the growth of empires. The Atlantic remained a vast frontier, full of danger, opportunity, and mystery. The consequences of Columbus's voyages were no longer hypothetical. They were unfolding in real time, shaping the course of history in ways both magnificent and tragic, leaving a legacy that would endure for centuries. The story of the Americas, sparked by Columbus's daring voyage across the Atlantic, had grown beyond any single man. It had become a story of survival and adaptation, of conquest and resistance, of trade and transformation, spanning oceans, continents, and generations. And as the 17th century dawned, the Caribbean and the broader Americas stood at the threshold of an even more complex and dramatic history, a history in which the choices, courage, and mistakes of those first explorers would continue to reverberate across the world. The stage was set. The Atlantic was alive with movement. The Americas were alive with change. And the story, begun by a bold man daring to sail westward into the unknown, was far from finished. The dawn of the 17th century marked an era in the Americas that was unlike anything the world had seen before, a time when the consequences of Columbus's voyage had rippled outward into every aspect of life, from politics to culture, from trade to survival. The Caribbean islands, once untouched and self-contained, had become a bustling theater of empire, commerce, and conflict. Ships from Spain, Portugal, France, and later England, and the Netherlands crisscrossed the Atlantic with increasing frequency, each one carrying not only men and goods, but ideas, diseases, and ambitions that would shape the New World for centuries. The islands, with their lush forests, abundant rivers, and fertile soil, were transformed into hubs of extraction and settlement, their landscapes increasingly defined by European desire and power. For the indigenous populations, the early decades of contact had been catastrophic, but survival demanded adaptation. Entire communities had been decimated by disease, forced labor, and violence. Yet others persisted, retreating into forests, swamps, and mountains to preserve life and culture. These hidden enclaves became centers of resistance, repositories of knowledge, and sanctuaries for traditions that Europeans sought to suppress. Leaders emerged who combined diplomacy with strategic defiance, negotiating temporary truces while planning escape or rebellion. The psychological toll of losing friends, relatives, and cultural heritage was immense. Yet, the resilience of these communities cannot be understated. They were learning, often at great cost, to navigate a world that had shifted under their feet, to survive in the shadows while adapting to foreign pressures, and to resist in ways both subtle and overt. Meanwhile, the European settlers were entrenching their presence, building towns, forts, and plantations that would become the backbone of empires. Gold mining, sugar cultivation, and trade networks created immense wealth for those who controlled them, while simultaneously entrenching systems of exploitation. Labor shortages, driven by the catastrophic impact of disease on indigenous populations, led to the growing reliance on enslaved Africans, whose arrival brought new cultural layers to the islands, while also creating profound human suffering. The social hierarchies of the colonies became rigid, with Spaniards and Europeans at the top, indigenous people and enslaved Africans at the bottom, and mixed-race populations navigating a precarious existence in between. Every village, every plantation, every port became a site where ambition, survival, and cruelty intersected, producing a complex, often brutal society that was both resilient and unstable. Trade across the Atlantic grew ever more intricate. Gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, and other commodities flowed steadily to Spain and Europe, funding the growth of cities, armies, and empires. Markets thrived, fueled by both the labor of the exploited and the demand of European consumers. The Columbian Exchange, the massive, unplanned transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures between the old and new worlds accelerated, transforming diets, economies, and ecosystems on a global scale. Corn, potatoes, cacao, and tomatoes became staples in Europe, while horses, pigs, and cattle reshaped landscapes and ways of life in the Americas. The planet itself seemed to pulse with movement, as human ambition and curiosity linked continents in an unprecedented network of exchange and influence. Amid this growth, conflict was inevitable. Indigenous uprisings continued, sometimes localized and sporadic, other times organized and sustained. European settlers clashed not only with local populations, but with each other, as rival nations, factions, and ambitious governors vied for control of land, resources, and trade routes. Forts and garrisons dotted coastlines and riverbanks, standing as both symbols of power and targets for attack. Pirates and privateers exploited these tensions, raiding ships and settlements, adding another layer of danger and unpredictability. The Atlantic was no longer a quiet expanse, but a theater of ambition, violence, and commerce, where the fates of countless lives were bound to the movement of ships, the swing of swords, and the unpredictability of weather and disease. Religion remained a central tool of influence and control. Catholic missionaries established churches, schools, and missions throughout the islands, seeking to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. These efforts were often coercive, imposing new beliefs while undermining native spiritual systems. Yet, religion was also a site of negotiation and adaptation. Many indigenous people blended Christian teachings with their traditional practices, creating syncretic forms of worship that allowed cultural memory to survive under the shadow of conquest. Churches became not only spiritual centers, but also instruments of political authority, reinforcing the social hierarchies imposed by colonial powers and legitimizing systems of labor and governance. Amid these sweeping changes, the environment itself bore the marks of transformation. Forests were cleared for plantations, settlements, and mines. Rivers were dammed or diverted, and native species were displaced or hunted to near extinction. Introduced animals, including horses, pigs, and cattle, altered ecosystems, creating new patterns of agriculture, predation, and disease. European settlers learned to adapt to hurricanes, tropical storms, and unpredictable weather, often at great cost. Life in the Caribbean demanded constant vigilance, flexibility, and resilience, forcing all who lived there, indigenous, European, or African, to navigate a world that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly. The psychological impact of these changes on indigenous communities cannot be overstated. Entire ways of life were disrupted, ancestral knowledge threatened, and cultural identities challenged. Yet, despite these pressures, indigenous people persisted. Secret ceremonies, oral traditions, and covert forms of education helped preserve languages, histories, and spiritual practices. Resistance took many forms, from strategic retreats and guerrilla attacks to subtle acts of defiance within settlements. These acts of resilience shaped the emerging colonial societies, influencing governance, labor systems, and cultural dynamics in ways that Europeans often failed to recognize. European ambition, meanwhile, continued to expand. Spain, emboldened by the flow of wealth and the successes of its early colonies, extended its reach across the Caribbean and into Central and South America. Other European powers, including France, England, and the Netherlands, began to challenge Spanish dominance, establishing footholds in islands like St. Kitts, Barbados, and Curaçao. These rivalries sparked skirmishes, privateering, and the development of military infrastructure, creating a Caribbean that was both a land of opportunity and a landscape of constant danger. Colonists and settlers were forced to navigate not only the challenges of the natural world, but but also the ever-shifting political and military landscape. Through all of this, the legacy of Columbus remained central. He had initiated a series of voyages that reshaped the globe, introducing European power into the Americas and setting in motion forces of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Yet the consequences of his actions were complex and often tragic. Indigenous societies were decimated or transformed, ecosystems altered, and human suffering multiplied on an unimaginable scale. At the same time, the connections forged between continents brought new knowledge, wealth, and ideas that would continue to shape the world for centuries. Columbus's voyage was no longer a single event. It was the catalyst for a vast, ongoing process that intertwined the destinies of millions across oceans and generations. The Caribbean islands, now centers of empire, trade, and cultural exchange, had become microcosms of a larger world in transformation. Life there was defined by struggle, adaptation, and resilience. Indigenous communities fought to survive and preserve their identities. European settlers worked to exploit and dominate. African slaves endured unimaginable hardship while maintaining cultural traditions that would resonate for generations. The islands were alive with human ambition, conflict, and creativity. A space where every decision, every encounter, and every storm could alter the course of history. And yet, amidst all this complexity, the Atlantic remained a frontier of mystery and possibility. New lands awaited discovery. Unknown cultures, rivers, mountains, and forests beckoned. Each ship that set sail carried the potential for wealth, conquest, and tragedy. The story of the Americas was far from complete. It was a story still being written by the movement of oceans, the ambitions of empires, and the courage and resilience of the people who inhabited these lands. Columbus's first voyage across the Atlantic had opened the door, but the world beyond that door was vast, unpredictable, and alive with possibilities, both hopeful and devastating. The legacy of the first explorers had taken root in a soil enriched by ambition and blood, in islands transformed by human hands and natural forces alike. The story of the Americas was now one of interconnected fates, global trade, cultural exchange, and relentless struggle. Every coastline, forest, river, and settlement carried the echoes of Columbus's voyage, the triumphs and tragedies of conquest, and the enduring resilience of those whose lives were forever changed. And as new generations looked toward the horizon, the Atlantic continued to beckon. Its waters, unpredictable and vast, promised new discoveries, new challenges, and new encounters, ensuring that the story Columbus had begun would unfold for centuries more, an epic tale of exploration, ambition, survival, and the inexorable intertwining of worlds once thought separate, now forever connected By the early decades of the 17th century, the Caribbean and the wider Americas had become a mosaic of human ambition, struggle, and adaptation, a region transformed almost beyond recognition from the days when Columbus first set foot on its shores. The islands that had once been pristine, dotted with thriving indigenous villages and untouched forests, now bore the marks of a new order, one imposed by European powers seeking wealth, prestige, and control. Forts rose along the coasts, towns expanded along riverbanks, and plantations spread across fertile valleys. Rivers once free-flowing and vital to the rhythm of native life were redirected for mills and irrigation, and forests were felled for timber, sugar, and grazing land. The very earth seemed to pulse with the consequences of human ambition. As natural systems and human societies collided with unprecedented intensity for the indigenous peoples who remained, survival demanded ingenuity, courage, and a willingness to adapt in ways that were often invisible to the newcomers. Entire communities had been decimated by disease, violence, and forced labor. Yet those who survived found ways to resist, to conceal traditions, and to preserve knowledge across generations. Hidden villages flourished deep in the interior of islands, shielded from European oversight, where elders taught younger generations ancestral skills, stories, and rituals. Guerrilla tactics became a way of life. Ambushes, sabotage, and stealthy raids challenged the settlers' authority, while strategic retreats allowed communities to endure against overwhelming odds. These acts of resistance were not merely reactions to conquest. They were deliberate strategies to survive in a world that had become dangerous, unpredictable, and dominated by foreign powers. European settlers, meanwhile, were learning that domination required more than swords and cannons. The tropical environment was unforgiving. Hurricanes, tropical storms, and flooding could wipe out entire settlements in a single night. Disease was a constant threat, striking both Europeans and indigenous laborers alike. Crops failed when soils were exhausted or pests proliferated. Settlers had to adapt, to learn from the land, and sometimes even to negotiate with indigenous communities for knowledge, protection, or labor. Survival required ingenuity, resilience, and an understanding that the Caribbean's beauty masked both peril and opportunity. Despite the hardships, the promise of gold, sugar, and other commodities drove relentless expansion, drawing more settlers, laborers, and administrators to the islands year after year. Trade networks across the Atlantic had become immensely complex, linking Europe, the Americas, and increasingly Africa in what would later be recognized as the first truly global economy. Gold and silver flowed steadily to Spain, financing wars, urban growth, and artistic patronage. Sugar, tobacco, and other other crops became engines of profit, demanding labor and infrastructure on a scale that reshaped the islands and the societies living on them. Ships carried not only wealth, but diseases, plants, animals, and cultural practices, transforming societies on both sides of the ocean. The Columbian exchange accelerated, forever altering diets, economies, and ecosystems. Corn, potatoes, cacao, and tomatoes enriched European tables and agricultural systems, while pigs, horses, and cattle reshaped landscapes and human activity in the Americas. The world was shrinking and expanding at the same time, as continents previously separated became deeply entwined. Religion continued to play a central role in the social and political fabric of the colonies. Missionaries and priests sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity, often employing coercion or force alongside education and ritual. Churches and missions became centers of authority, reinforcing the hierarchical social order while attempting to replace native spiritual practices. Yet indigenous peoples found ways to preserve their beliefs, blending Christian elements with traditional rituals to create syncretic practices that survived under the surface of colonial control. Religion was both a tool of domination and a site of cultural negotiation, reflecting the tensions between conquest and survival, power and adaptation, oppression and resilience. Conflict, both subtle and overt, defined the Caribbean landscape. Indigenous uprisings, though increasingly difficult to sustain, continued to challenge European control. Settlers also clashed with each other, as rival factions and competing nations sought dominance over islands, trade routes, and resources. Forts and garrisons became vital for survival, while piracy and privateering introduced constant unpredictability into maritime life. The Atlantic, once a daunting expanse, had become a conduit for commerce, conquest, and competition. Its waters carrying not only goods, but the ambitions, fears, and destinies of countless individuals across continents. Every voyage was fraught with risk. Every settlement teetered between success and disaster. And every hurricane reminded inhabitants of nature's immense power over human endeavors. Amid the turbulence, the human stories remained compelling. Indigenous families struggled to maintain their communities and traditions, often at immense personal cost. Europeans faced the challenges of survival, political rivalries, and the moral ambiguities of conquest. Enslaved Africans endured brutal conditions while creating new cultural expressions that blended memory, resilience, and innovation. Children grew up in a world defined by conflict, adaptation, and survival. Across the islands, life was a series of negotiations with the environment, with social hierarchies, and with the broader forces of empire that had transformed the Caribbean into a living, breathing theater of human ambition and endurance. By now, Columbus's influence was everywhere, even in his absence. He had opened the door, but the consequences of that opening had expanded far beyond his vision. The systems of governance, labor, and trade that emerged after his voyages shaped societies, economies, and ecologies for centuries. The islands were not simply territories to be conquered. They were spaces where cultural interaction, exploitation, and survival created a complex and enduring legacy. The consequences of his journey had become self-perpetuating, influencing every voyage, settlement, and interaction in the Americas. The Atlantic Ocean remained a frontier of endless possibility and danger. Explorers continued to map unknown coastlines. Settlers expanded inland, and trade networks grew ever more intricate. Each ship that sailed westward carried the potential for fortune, disaster, or transformation. The Caribbean and surrounding regions became laboratories of adaptation, survival, and cultural exchange, where every day brought the promise of opportunity and the threat of catastrophe. Knowledge accumulated rapidly as settlers learned to navigate storms, cultivate new crops, manage labor, and defend against both environmental and human threats. Yet even as empires expanded and societies adapted, uncertainty remained, a reminder that the Americas, vast and diverse, were still a frontier in the truest sense. By the mid-17th century, the Caribbean and the broader Americas were no longer peripheral territories, but central nodes in a global system. Trade, labor, culture, and power flowed across the Atlantic in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. The islands had become crucibles in which European ambition, indigenous resilience, and African endurance intersected, creating new social orders, cultural practices, and economic systems. The world that Columbus had glimpsed in 1492 had been irrevocably transformed. The consequences of his daring voyage, the courage, curiosity, ambition, and miscalculation, continued to unfold, shaping landscapes, societies, and histories far beyond the man himself. And yet, despite the vast changes, the horizon remained a place of wonder and threat. The Atlantic called to new explorers, promising lands, resources, and the chance to leave a mark on history. The Caribbean, once tranquil and isolated, had become a hub of movement, negotiation, and survival. A space where the consequences of conquest and discovery were written on every coastline, in every forest, and across every river. The story that Columbus had begun was still being written, evolving with every generation, every settlement, and every interaction between peoples of vastly different worlds. The age of exploration had expanded beyond imagination, and the Americas were its living, dynamic testament. The interplay of ambition, survival, exploitation, and resilience ensured that the story of these islands and the people who inhabited them would continue to unfold with drama, complexity, and consequence for centuries to come. Columbus's first voyage had set the stage, but the Atlantic remained vast, the islands full of untold stories, and the legacy of discovery, conquest, and cultural collision still unfolding in ways that would shape the entire world. As the 17th century advanced, the Caribbean and the wider Americas were no longer the remote, untouched lands that Columbus had first glimpsed on his voyage in 1492. They had become the center of a vast and complex web of human ambition, survival, and cultural transformation. The islands were alive with motion, the creaking of ships in harbor, the hum of markets, the distant sound of church bells calling settlers to prayer, and often the muted cries of those who labored under the weight of conquest and enslavement. Every river, valley, and coastline bore witness to a collision of worlds. A collision that had begun with a single daring voyage across the Atlantic, but now resonated through countless lives, lands, and generations. For the indigenous peoples, life had become a precarious balance between endurance and resistance. Entire societies had been uprooted by disease, forced labor, and warfare. And yet survival remained possible through adaptability and cunning. Communities that had retreated to forests, swamps, and mountains formed the backbone of a hidden resistance, preserving cultural traditions and knowledge against overwhelming odds. Leaders emerged, not just to fight, but to strategize, to navigate complex social and political landscapes, and to ensure that knowledge, language, and rituals survived in secret. They learned to exploit the very systems imposed by the settlers, negotiating, deceiving, and sometimes collaborating, all while maintaining a vision of autonomy that refused to vanish despite centuries of encroachment. European settlers continued to expand their reach, driven by a relentless pursuit of wealth, status, and survival. The lure of gold, sugar, and tobacco transformed the islands into sprawling centers of production and trade. Labor shortages caused by disease and resistance prompted the large-scale importation of enslaved Africans, adding new layers of culture, resilience, and human suffering. Plantations and mines became both engines of profit and symbols of oppression, their operations dependent on the mastery of land, labor, and force. Settlers adapted to the brutal realities of the Caribbean climate, learning to endure hurricanes, floods, and the relentless heat. They fortified towns, constructed roads, and mapped rivers, gradually turning the once wild islands into structured centers of European control. Yet always vulnerable to rebellion, disaster, and human error, trade networks across the Atlantic were now intricately tied to the economies and lives of those in the Americas. Silver and gold flowed steadily to Spain, funding not just exploration, but wars, politics, and European lifestyles. Commodities like sugar, tobacco, cacao, and indigo became central to European markets, while corn, potatoes, and tomatoes reshaped diets and agricultural systems across the continent. The movement of people, goods, and ideas transformed both worlds simultaneously. European powers competed not only for land and resources, but also for strategic dominance over trade routes. Pirates, privateers, and rival nations introduced further instability, ensuring that the Caribbean remained a theater of both commerce and conflict. The Atlantic Ocean had become a living highway of human endeavor, ambition, and danger. Cultural exchanges were profound, often violent, yet also incredibly creative. Indigenous people learned European agricultural techniques, construction methods, and military tactics, while Europeans adapted to tropical climates, local crops, and survival strategies. African slaves brought with them languages, religions, music, and artisanal skills that would merge with indigenous and European traditions to form entirely new cultural identities. In the cities and ports of the Caribbean, marketplaces became crossroads of exchange, not just of goods, but of knowledge, ideas, and customs. The islands were microcosms of a new globalized world, spaces where adaptation was essential, survival uncertain, and identity constantly negotiated. The environment itself continued to change dramatically. Forests were felled to make room for plantations and settlements. Rivers were diverted to power mills, and introduced species such as horses, pigs, and cattle disrupted ecosystems in ways that would take centuries to understand. Hurricanes, tropical storms, and droughts reminded settlers and indigenous peoples alike of the raw power of nature, which no human ambition could fully control. Land, water, and climate became crucial players in the unfolding drama, shaping settlement patterns, labor systems, and economic strategies. Every human action had an ecological consequence, intertwining the destinies of people and land inextricably. Amid this vast transformation, the stories of individuals remained striking. Indigenous families worked tirelessly to preserve their communities, often hiding traditions and knowledge from European eyes. Settlers faced not only physical challenges, but also moral and ethical dilemmas as they navigated the consequences of conquest and governance. Enslaved Africans endured unimaginable suffering, yet they also resisted through culture, religion, and small acts of defiance, ensuring that memory and identity survived across generations. The Caribbean became a stage for countless human dramas, each unfolding alongside hurricanes, trade, disease, and empire building. Life was intense, often cruel, yet defined by resilience, adaptability, unwavering will to survive. Religion continued to assert itself as a powerful force in shaping societies. Catholic missionaries spread across the islands, converting, instructing, and often coercing indigenous peoples to adopt European spiritual practices. Churches became centers of administration, community, and power, shaping the social order in ways that reinforced European dominance. Yet resistance persisted in the form of syncretic practices, where native beliefs blended with Christian teachings to preserve identity and tradition. Religion thus became both a site of control and a field of negotiation, reflecting the ongoing struggle between domination and survival, between imposed order and inherited freedom. The legacy of Columbus, though long past, was everywhere visible. He had opened the door, but the consequences of that opening extended far beyond the islands he first touched. Systems of governance, labor, trade, and culture, now intertwined across continents, creating new societal orders and hierarchies. The Caribbean islands became laboratories where European ambition, indigenous resilience, and African endurance intersected, producing societies that were complex, dynamic, and often contradictory. The consequences of that first voyage continued to unfold, shaping political boundaries, economic systems, and cultural practices for generations to come. By the mid-17th century, the Americas had become central to a global story. The Atlantic Ocean, once feared and mysterious, had become a conduit for movement, knowledge, and commerce. Ships carried not just goods, but people, diseases, ideas, and ambitions that would reshape both the new and old worlds. Every settlement, every port, and every plantation was part of a vast, interconnected system of power and survival. The islands themselves, Hispaniola, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and others, stood as testaments to human ambition, adaptability, and the profound consequences of discovery. The Caribbean was no longer simply a destination. It had become a crucible in which the full drama of the age of exploration played out. Indigenous peoples, European settlers, and African slaves all contributed to its evolving identity, each group navigating survival, power, and resistance in a world reshaped by Columbus's daring voyage. And yet, despite centuries of transformation, the horizon remained wide, mysterious, and full of promise. The Atlantic continued to beckon, offering new lands to explore, new challenges to confront, and new stories to unfold. The story that Columbus had begun was no longer the tale of a single voyage. It had grown into an epic narrative of human ambition, cultural collision, survival, and transformation. A story that would continue to evolve with every passing year, shaping the destinies of peoples, nations, and the very world itself. The Caribbean, once an unknown cluster of islands, had become a symbol of opportunity, danger, and human resilience. And the journey of discovery, conquest, and adaptation was far from over. The stage was set for further exploration, for greater conflicts, for alliances and betrayals, and for the relentless unfolding of a history that would connect oceans, continents, and generations in ways that no one, not even Columbus himself, could have imagined. The world was alive, and its story was only just beginning to reveal the true scope of its complexity, danger, and wonder. By the latter half of the 17th century, the Americas, particularly the Caribbean, had transformed into a place of relentless motion, ambition, and human drama. The islands were no longer the tranquil, untouched landscapes Columbus had first beheld. They had become bustling centers of trade, conflict, and cultural interweaving. Each coastline and riverbank alive with the ceaseless activity of a world being rewritten. Ships arrived and departed daily, carrying European settlers, enslaved Africans, merchants, and missionaries, while also transporting the whispers of distant empires, news of rebellions, and rumors of hidden riches. The soundscape of the islands was now a cacophony of hammering from construction, the cries of marketplaces, the rhythm of church bells, and often the distant rumble of cannon fire, reminding everyone that life here was fragile, contested, and unpredictable. For the indigenous peoples, survival was a daily act of resilience and strategy. Diseases had long since decimated populations, but cultural endurance persisted. Hidden communities, deep in forests and mountains, became sanctuaries where traditions, languages, and histories survived. These enclaves were not isolated. They were centers of careful negotiation and resistance. Indigenous leaders employed both diplomacy and force to navigate the shifting powers of European settlers. Alliances were made and broken, strategic retreats executed, and raids launched, all with the goal of preserving life, identity, and cultural memory. Even under extreme pressure, these communities retained a connection to their ancestral lands, maintaining a spiritual and practical knowledge of forests, rivers, and mountains that allowed them to outmaneuver their colonizers in ways the Europeans often failed to anticipate. European settlers, meanwhile, had carved out a society that balanced opportunity with constant peril. Towns, forts, and plantations sprawled across the islands, marking the growing reach of European empires. Gold, silver, sugar, and tobacco were the lifeblood of these settlements, driving relentless labor and the importation of enslaved Africans to meet the economic demand. Daily life for settlers was defined by toil, survival, and vigilance. Hurricanes and tropical storms were ever-present threats, capable of destroying homes, crops, and entire towns in a single night. Disease claimed lives indiscriminately, striking both settlers and indigenous laborers. And the heat and humidity tested every human endurance. Settlers adapted to these challenges through ingenuity, often learning from indigenous knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and the natural rhythms of the land. Survival demanded intelligence, flexibility, and a certain ruthlessness. Trade networks had become global in scale. European markets were now supplied with sugar, cacao, tobacco, and other commodities from the Americas, transforming lifestyles, diets, and economies across continents. Ships returned with riches that fueled wars, funded the arts, and cemented the influence of European powers. Yet these exchanges were never neutral. They depended on the labor of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, often exacting a human toll of unimaginable magnitude. The very landscape of the islands had been remade to suit economic ambitions. Forests cleared, rivers diverted, and entire ecosystems altered. Humans and nature were now inextricably entwined, each influencing the other in ways that were both predictable and catastrophic. Religion remained a force of both control and cultural negotiation. Catholic missionaries sought to convert indigenous populations and regulate social behavior, while European settlers often used faith to legitimize labor systems and political authority. Yet indigenous and African traditions persisted, blending with European practices to create syncretic religions that reflected the resilience and creativity of colonized peoples. Spiritual life became a field of resistance, adaptation, and survival, demonstrating that even under oppression, human communities could preserve identity, hope, and meaning. Conflict was omnipresent. Indigenous uprisings, European rivalries, and pirate raids ensured that the Caribbean remained a place of constant tension. Fortifications were strengthened, militias organized, and alliances carefully negotiated, but uncertainty remained. Every village, plantation, and port existed in a delicate balance, where the forces of nature, politics, and human ambition could converge violently at any moment. In this environment, courage, cunning, and resilience became as valuable as gold or sugar. The Caribbean was no longer just a geographical location. It was a crucible in which human endurance, ingenuity, and morality were tested daily. Amid this turbulence, the human stories were extraordinary. Indigenous families preserved and adapted cultural practices, ensuring that histories and knowledge survived. Settlers navigated not only physical hardships, but also ethical dilemmas, negotiating the blurred lines between survival, greed, and cruelty. Enslaved Africans resisted in subtle and overt ways, maintaining community, religion, and memory despite unimaginable suffering. Each of these stories of courage, endurance, and adaptation was intertwined, contributing to a larger narrative of human resilience in the face of relentless change. The Caribbean became a theater of epic human drama, where every choice could determine life or death, freedom or captivity, survival or annihilation. The environmental impact of human activity intensified. Forests were cleared to create plantations and settlements. Rivers were altered to supply water to crops and mills. And non-native species disrupted ecosystems in irreversible ways. Hurricanes, floods, and droughts reminded humans of their vulnerability, while the delicate balance of native plants and animals was continually challenged by the demands of European economies. The land itself was both a resource and a character in this story, sometimes nurturing, sometimes punishing, always shaping the lives of those who inhabited it. Humans learned to read its rhythms, adapt to its dangers, and harness its abundance. Yet, they also confronted the consequences of ecological transformation that would reverberate for centuries. The legacy of Columbus remained profound, complex, and contradictory. He had opened a door to worlds previously unknown to Europeans. But the results of that opening extended far beyond him, spanning continents, peoples, and centuries. His voyages catalyzed the movement of cultures, the exchange of goods, and the emergence of new social hierarchies. The Caribbean islands, once a backdrop for exploration, had become central to the unfolding story of global history, a place where ambition, survival, exploitation, and resilience intersected in vivid and often tragic ways. The human imprint on these islands was undeniable, shaping societies, economies, and ecologies in ways that would endure far beyond the first generation of European settlement. By now, the Americas were more than territories. They were a living, evolving system of interconnected forces, indigenous resilience, European ambition, and African endurance had fused to create societies that were dynamic, diverse, and often volatile. The Caribbean had become a microcosm of global interaction, reflecting the triumphs and tragedies of human ambition, cultural exchange, and survival. The legacy of exploration had expanded into a story of conquest, resistance, and adaptation that continued to unfold across oceans and generations. And yet, despite centuries of change, the horizon remained wide and full of mystery. The Atlantic beckoned new explorers, promising lands yet unclaimed, wealth yet untapped, and challenges yet unimagined. Every wave carried the potential for discovery, disaster, or transformation, reminding all who lived in the Americas that the story of this vast, vibrant, and tumultuous world was far from over. The journey that Columbus began in 1492 had sparked an epic narrative, one of conquest and survival, exploitation and resilience, devastation and creation, that would continue to shape the lives of millions and the course of history itself. The Caribbean, with its storms and sunshine, forests and coasts, had become the stage for a story larger than any one person, empire, or nation. The currents of the Atlantic, the resilience of indigenous peoples, the labor of enslaved Africans, and the ambitions of European settlers converged to create a world both breathtaking and brutal. And as new generations looked toward the horizon, the legacy of discovery, conflict, and adaptation ensured that the narrative of the Americas would continue, unfolding with drama, complexity, and enduring human significance. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Americas had transformed into a living testament to the far-reaching consequences of Christopher Columbus's daring voyage over 2 centuries earlier. The islands and continents that once seemed distant, mysterious, and untouched were now interwoven into a vast network of human ambition, culture, and commerce. The Caribbean, in particular, stood as a stage upon which the complexities of conquest, survival, and adaptation played out daily. Towns thrived on the edges of rivers, ports buzzed with trade, and plantations stretched across valleys, producing sugar, tobacco, and cacao for European markets. Yet beneath the surface of this bustling activity lay layers of tension, resilience, and memory that carried the echoes of lives forever altered by the first footsteps of Columbus and those who followed him. Indigenous peoples, despite centuries of conquest, disease, and displacement, had endured. Hidden communities deep within forests and mountains preserved languages, rituals, and wisdom, passing them down from one generation to the next. Guerrilla tactics, strategic retreats, and careful negotiations with European settlers allowed many to survive and even thrive in pockets of autonomy. In doing so, they maintained a cultural thread that connected them to their ancestors and their land, resisting full erasure despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against them. These acts of endurance were both ordinary and extraordinary, quiet defiance that spoke volumes about human resilience and the determination to survive in the face of catastrophe. African slaves, forcibly brought to the Americas, carried the weight of unimaginable suffering. Yet they too forged new paths of survival and resistance through music, storytelling, religion, and communal bonds. They preserved fragments of memory and identity while creating new cultures that would define the Caribbean and parts of the Americas for centuries to come. Their contributions, often invisible to European settlers, were central to the social and economic fabric of the colonies. Enslaved peoples resisted in countless ways through escape, subtle sabotage, spiritual defiance, and cultural preservation, reminding the world that even under oppression, humanity could assert its dignity, memory, and creativity. European settlers, meanwhile, continued to expand their reach, building towns, roads, forts, and plantations to secure their claims and profits. Yet life in the Caribbean was never simple. Hurricanes, floods, disease, and conflict constantly threatened their survival. Political rivalries between European powers erupted into wars and skirmishes, while pirate raids and indigenous uprisings added layers of danger. Settlers had to negotiate with the environment and with one another, navigating a world where fortune and disaster were often separated by a single storm or a single decision. Life was precarious, intense, and full of both opportunity and peril. Trade networks stretched across the Atlantic and beyond, connecting the Americas to Europe, Africa, and eventually Asia. Gold and silver flowed to European treasuries. Sugar and tobacco fueled industries and markets, and knowledge and culture traveled alongside goods and people. The Columbian Exchange reshaped the world, introducing crops, animals, and diseases that transformed ecosystems and human life on an unprecedented scale. Corn and potatoes became staples in Europe, while pigs and horses altered landscapes in the Americas. Every corner of the globe was affected by the movement of people and resources set in motion by that first voyage in 1492. A testament to the power of curiosity, ambition, and human ingenuity, religion remained both a tool of control and a source of resilience. Catholic missionaries established churches and schools, seeking to convert indigenous peoples and consolidate social order. Yet both indigenous and African spiritual practices persisted, blending with European traditions to create syncretic religions that resisted full erasure and preserved identity in the midst of domination. Spiritual life became a site of negotiation, adaptation, and resistance, reflecting the complex interactions between power, belief, and survival. The natural environment of the Americas bore the marks of centuries of human activity. Forests were cleared for plantations, rivers diverted for irrigation, and non-native species reshaped ecosystems. Hurricanes, droughts, and storms reminded all who lived there that human ambition had limits, and that the land itself was a powerful, unpredictable force. Yet these challenges were met with ingenuity, resilience, and a growing understanding of how to harness the environment to human purposes. The interaction between people and land became a defining feature of life in the Americas, shaping settlements, economies, and cultural practices. And through it all, the legacy of Columbus loomed large. He had opened a door to worlds previously unknown to Europeans, but the consequences of that opening extended far beyond the man himself. The Americas had become a site of immense cultural exchange, human suffering, and economic transformation. Societies had evolved in ways that were unforeseen, blending European, indigenous, and African influences into complex, dynamic civilizations. The Columbian voyage had ignited a chain reaction that reshaped the globe, forging connections, conflicts, and creations that would endure for centuries. By the end of the 17th century, the Caribbean and the Americas were no longer peripheral regions. They were central to global history. They were crucibles of human ambition, endurance, and adaptation, where life was defined by the collision of worlds, the struggle for survival, and the persistence of culture in the face of conquest. The story of these lands was one of continuous transformation, shaped by natural forces, human ambition, and the enduring spirit of the peoples who inhabited them. Every river, every forest, every settlement bore the imprint of centuries of exploration, conflict, adaptation, and resilience. And yet, the horizon remained wide and full of possibility. The Atlantic continued to beckon, promising new discoveries, challenges, and opportunities. Life in the Americas was still a story being written, evolving with each generation, each storm, each voyage. The journey that Columbus had begun in 1492 had set in motion forces that would continue to shape the world, connecting continents, peoples, and cultures in ways that were both magnificent and tragic. The ripple effects of that single voyage extended far beyond any individual life, weaving an intricate, complex, and enduring story of humanity. The tale of Columbus's journey and the vast consequences that followed is ultimately a story of interconnected fates, of exploration and exploitation, of resilience and adaptation, of tragedy and creation. It is a story that reminds us how one moment, one daring crossing of an unknown ocean, can alter the course of history forever. The Americas, shaped by the collision of worlds, continue to carry the legacy of that journey. The triumphs, the suffering, the ingenuity, and the enduring human spirit. And as the sun rises over the islands, rivers, and coasts that first greeted Columbus, the story continues, living in the land, in the people, and in the endless horizon of possibility that the world offers. The voyage that began with a single ship setting sail into the unknown had become the foundation of a global story, one that echoes through centuries, reminding us that discovery is never simple, that conquest comes with consequences, and that resilience and human courage can endure even in the face of overwhelming change. The story of the Americas and the legacy of Columbus is now complete in its telling. But the lands, peoples, and cultures he touched continue to shape history, endlessly unfolding, forever connected by the daring voyage that began over 500 years ago.